Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back once again with Steve Bancars, and we've got another good pop culture new age topic to talk about, and that is karma.
Karma.
Yes. Can you give us a brief definition of what karma is? I mean, everybody uses the word, you hear it all the time, you see it all over the place, but I mean, what's the full concept?
Yeah,
there?
karma, it's a Hindu term that refers to this idea that we have many, many past lives. And during the course of each past life, we, of course, do things that are wrong. And when we do things that are wrong, we incur a moral debt. And that moral debt is called karma.
Okay.
We build up bad karma, but you can also do good deeds to contribute to your good karma to help weigh out the bad karma.
Mm-hmm.
But the purpose of incarnation, reincarnating over and over and over again, is so that you can pay off and alleviate the karma from a previous life and eventually reach a place where your good karma outweighs your bad karma.
Mm-hmm.
And then you no longer need to continue on in this cycle of death and rebirth called samsara.
Mm-hmm.
So the belief in karma is the belief that you can incur negative moral debt that you must pay off in a future incarnation. And how do you pay that off? By being the recipient of the exact same kind of evil. So if in this life I was a stockbroker or something, and I lived a really greedy, selfish life like all stockbrokers are.
All the lawyers are relieved because they're the ones who usually get picked on.
Right. Yeah, and I was really oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
I was really greedy. I would, lift my nose up at homeless people. Maybe there was a series of times throughout my life where I legitimately neglected opportunities to contribute to people's welfare when they were poor, like in a financial sense. That would mean that because I was abusing the position I was in, and I was in part abusing others, I must now incarnate and know what it's like to be poor, so that I can experience, my soul can work that off.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like when you owe somebody money, you go work in their field kind of thing. You're literally paying off with your life
Mm-hmm.
Your moral debt that you incurred in a previous life. If you abused someone sexually, you must be abused sexually. So then you'll choose a life in advance that involves sexual abuse, so that you can learn those lessons that you didn't learn in the previous life.
When you say you'll choose a life in advance, how is that possible?
Well, the belief is that your life isn't arbitrarily picked for you. You cooperate in the spirit realm prior to your next incarnation in order to construct a life along with entities who are watching over you.
So the idea is that if you understand this system and you go out and do these things, you are sort of selecting what comes next.
You are. In the spirit world, you select what comes next. What's the abuse I'm going to receive? What's the trauma I'm going to receive to alleviate the karma from my past life and learn the lessons I did not learn in my previous incarnation. And so that, of course, this is just definitionally completely contrary to anything compatible with the Christian worldview. And we'll make distinctions about the nuances of what goes around comes around, and sowing and reaping in a sec.
Yeah, because that's how it that's how it appears in the pop culture.
That is how it appears in the pop culture. But think about the moral implications of reincarnation and karma, which can't exist without the concept of reincarnation, on moral ethic. There's a reason why it's seen as being improper and inappropriate within the caste system in India to be serviceful unto lower classes and to help people who are poor. They're working up that negative karma. Don't interfere with that. Don't help that abuse victim. Right. Let them work off that karma. Don't interfere.
If you help them, then they're going to have. It's going to take longer to work that off.
You're going to delay their ascension.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to delay their process of enlightenment by interfering.
That's really sinister. When you really think about it.
It is very sinister. It promotes complete moral complacency for evil. Yeah. And Christians will think to themselves, I believe in some principle of what goes around comes around. First of all, that's not what karma is. If it were what goes around comes around, it's still garbage. It still has no place.
Well, they're equating it with something like, the book of Numbers says, be sure your sin will find you out. But that's really not what that verse is saying.
Right.
It's not talking about an intentional reversal and all this kind of stuff.
Right. It's not talking about you having to actually live out.
Yeah.
It's not talking about this. So if I do a break and enter, if I'm 16 years old, for example, involved in gang activity, the belief in what goes around comes around would entail me to believe that later on in my life, I'm going to have to be stolen from, or in a future incarnation, in order to experience that and pay that off. And a lot of Christians, they buy into this and they think if they got stolen from, they'll tie it back to some experience they had in their adolescence. I knew.
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of a cultural response.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's crazy that Eastern philosophy has been so permeated into Western thought that this belief in karma is so fundamental to our ideology that we don't even consider where it came from. It's just part of the nuts and bolts of how we think about our life morally.
Do you think, in America, we have this sense that we have such a long Christian tradition that is so familiar that, again, familiarity breeds contempt, that people can talk about Jesus, they can talk about God, they can talk about this or that, and they don't mean anything by it. Do you think it's the same with karma? I mean, it is ingrained, because you do see it all over the place. Can we attribute any significance to it, or does it work the same way as sort of this cultural Christianity? Do we just have cultural karma now, where it's sort of this neutral thing?
I think we do. I think that's what happens when you try to westernize Eastern principles. There's been such a heavy inpouring of Eastern principles into Western civilization, starting really with theosophy, I guess you could say, and becoming accelerated with people like Aleister Crowley and the like. And so because Greek thought and Judeo-Christian values really are the backbone of Western civilization, an argument can be made for that. When Eastern principles come over here, they don't mesh well with that immediately, but they try to become incorporated anyway, just by virtue of the fact that they're so pervasive and heavily pushed through, social media outlets today, or certain social media figures, or people like Oprah Winfrey, for example. And what you're left with is a very stripped down, diluted version of these principles, where you're trying to hold on to a Western framework and understand these Eastern principles within a Western framework. And then you got, Christian yoga or Western yoga.
How seriously do you think people take the karma idea? Because I think the general assumption would be, and again, this is the one I would have had, that yes, it's this balancing between bad stuff and good stuff, but what you described is a whole lot more precise. It's not just a general good versus bad, and you work away this and get that, but it's really, I don't know what the right term is for it, but it's really symbiotic. I mean, it's kind for kind, that kind of thing.
It is. But even if it were working off, that you could quantify moral evil with a certain numerical amount to work off, 3 karma points, bad karma points with 3
Sounds
good
like a
karma
video
points.
game.
Right. But even if it were that kind of a system where it wasn't, eye for an eye, but just evil for evil, even if that were the case, it is still completely theologically ignorant to the purpose and extent of the atonement, which is, of course, Colossians 2:14 says, the record of offenses that stood against us was nailed to the cross, being done away with. Right? So Jesus Christ, he bore our sin in his body on the tree. All of our moral debt was expiated on the cross. The judgment of the Father came upon him. He was judged in our place. He was accounted one of the sinners that we could be accounted righteous. So our account, our life record, if you will, has already been judged, the judgment satisfied and done away with on the cross.
Yeah, I just don't know how systems like this give anybody hope, because it's this, it's this path to maybe not perfectibility, maybe that's not the right word, but this like total, this zero sum kind of thing. And I don't know how anyone could ever imagine, much less really think or believe, that they would ever be able to sort of engineer this set of circumstances where it all washes out, and now we've gotten rid of the bad karma. We've never accumulated any more. I mean, I just don't know how anybody has any hope. Maybe they don't, in this system. Like, they can see how it operates, So it's this theoretical thing to sort of go after, but for anybody who would put serious thought into it, I just can't see where they would see it as attainable.
Yeah, it just leads to complete bondage and a never-ending cycle of just a snake eating its own tail. And that's why you can have a theoretically infinite amount of incarnations.
Well, you'd have to,
right.
Yeah, how could you get away from that?
Well, you can leave the wheel of karma, if you will, through enlightenment, right? But those who attain that, it's very few and far between who reach that state of consciousness called moksha, and they can really finally break free of this karmic cycle. But for the ordinary person, they'll have to have dozens, scores, hundreds, thousands of incarnations.
It would seem even for those elite, a belief in their eliteness has to be assigned by the masses. Right. In other words, it doesn't seem to have any intrinsic value to it. You know, that they're elite because most everybody thinks they're elite. And for whatever reason, they just wind up in this category.
Right.
And it's not transferable in any way.
No, exactly. So it's just complete bondage. It's a works-based system of salvation and of atonement, which is really what distinguishes the Christian faith from any type of religious system.
Really anything else.
Yeah, including New Age. In the New Age, it's not just to alleviate bad karma, it's to raise your vibration, clear your mind, make sure your chakras are aligned and clear. There's study the mysteries.
There's still a grocery list of things to do. Yeah.
Grocery list, constantly, and that plays into alleviating negative karma. It's a grocery list of things you have to do to escape this inevitable fate of a potential never-ending amount of incarnations. And there's no freedom in that ideology at all. And so thankfully Christians can rest assured that this idea of karma, whether it's the Hindu theistic version that's based in reincarnation, or whether it's the westernized version of what goes around comes around. I mean, it ultimately does on Judgment Day. That's when it goes around, comes around, but not in this life, not in a future incarnation. In this life, there's no guarantee you're going to be held accountable judicially for all the sins you've committed, right? There's people who are, gang lords. They live their full life out as a gang lord, and their sin never catches up to them, and they just live a relatively successful life, and then they die. And obviously there's hell to pay for that. But this idea that what you do in this life will eventually catch up with you and find you out, that's not at all true or promised biblically. And that does reflect this Eastern principle of karma, this diluted version that's become part of the Christian groupthink, where it's like, well, the Bible says whoever sows to the flesh will reap from the flesh destruction. There's a difference to saying there's going to be negative consequences to our actions spiritually and in the natural, to saying I'm incurring moral debt that some metaphysical law or metaphysical force requires me to endure that same degree of evil in this life. Completely different statements. Of course, if I cheat on my wife, whoever commits adultery destroys his own soul.
Yeah, and that back to the Numbers passage, be sure your sin will find you out. That's not really a metaphysical statement. It's not the point of it. The point is consequences.
Right.
Discovery, consequences, even the consequences might be a generation or so removed, but there's just going to be consequences.
That's right.
Yeah, it will end up tripping you up and trapping you, or somebody else, that'll suffer because of what you did.
Right, if not your own suffering, even if nobody else suffers, right? Your own soul suffering, right? There's no peace or light in a life of sin, right? The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. But there's a difference between saying, if I sin against myself or against another, there's going to be some kind of consequence, and saying, what goes around comes around. As if I was a bully in high school, I'm going to get bullied when I'm 40 or 30. I'm going to get what's coming to me still. Or I stole when I was a child, now I'm going to be stolen from. The universe or God is going to make sure I'm stolen from.
Yeah, and to wrap up, I'm struck by the realization that, okay, most Christians aren't going to sort of knowingly trade, the gospel, the work of the cross for this, but it really, you can see how this kind of thinking could become part of a person's life in terms of their thought processes, and it really says something about their view of God. Like big concept things like providence.
Right.
How that can be tainted and sort of distorted, by this kind of thinking. So it does have a theological effect, maybe not in soteriology necessarily, but but just in the way who God is and the way he relates to us.
Yeah, for me the most striking is its implications on the atonement, as we talked about a little bit earlier. Like, either you believe Christ paid the price in full, he gave his life as a ransom for all your sins, or you don't.
And that's a lot of Christians just suffer with their own works.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
that's just a battle all the time, and this sort of makes it worse, or is a new way to mess it up.
Right.
You know, it's
Yeah.
a new way to get it wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that, sometimes ministers think that the gospel is just for the unsaved. The gospel is for Christians too. Right? Paul tells the churches he's preaching to, far be it from me to boast in anything except the cross of Christ, and I long to preach nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. He wanted people to know this is what Christ did. You're forgiven as far as the east is from the west.
Yeah,
right?
You still need to be reminded of
right.
it. Yeah.
He bore your sin in his body on the tree. He was bruised for our transgressions. He paid the price in full. It is finished, is what he said. There's no more moral debt I have to pay off before God. It's already done. Jesus was judged in my place. And it's a matter of believing and receiving the atoning work that he already accomplished. But the fact that this karmic principle of what goes around comes around can even work its way into the thought life of Christians is not only a sign of the pervasiveness of Eastern thought in the West, it's also a testament to the I don't want to be mean to people, because there's probably some watching who are like, hey, I've never thought about it like this.
Right,
but
there's some issue of theological illiteracy.
And it's not necessarily people's fault. Maybe it's the
Yeah.
church at large, biblical illiteracy, what have you. But it has grave implications on, do we really understand the gospel and what Jesus did for us on that tree? Because if you believe in karma, then you really don't have a solid grasp of that, and then you're living in bondage.
Yeah, well, thanks again for another good discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Fringe Pop 321. If you want to support what we're doing here, go to fp321.com/s, as in the letter S, and please visit our website and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because what you know may not be so.